not essential about that.
All right. Testing. Testing. Okay, so all right, so we have a lot to do today. I'm going to test this. Technology is a wonderful thing until it doesn't work, and then you're standing up here looking like an idiot when it worked the other day. So you had a critical thinking challenge that was due today that we were going to talk about in your groups, and it dealt with globalization and the international markets and money. And was there a region or a country that posed a significant threat to the United States in terms of its economic supremacy? And that ties in nicely with the chapter that we're going to talk about on segmenting markets, targeting, and then positioning. And then the next exam will be on Tuesday. So I'm also going to do an exam review. So we've got a lot to do today. I'm going to turn the camera around so that we can get you. And what I said I would do is we would start with whichever group is the first on the back row, and then kind of serpentine around through until we get through all of your groups and your answers on the critical thinking challenge. I did not post a grade for those yet because obviously you hadn't done your little presentation. You know, if you do the presentation, you pretty much get the credit for it, but I didn't post the grades for that yet. I am working diligently on getting your article reviews done. I've done about a little more than a third of those, and last night for some reason the rubric on D2L that I had populated stopped working, and I'm not sure why that is. So I contacted tech support, so I had intended to have those done for you by today, and I apologize for not having that. I'm not sure what happens. D2L works in strange and mysterious ways. It may have been that they updated something and put a patch and it stopped the rubric from populating. So I will hopefully get those all done, but some of you already have grades on that. And for those of you that don't, again, I apologize. I try to get those done within a week so that you have your grades on it and you know what you've got. But like I said, at some point it just stopped populating into, it would let me click on the rubric and it would open it up and pull it, but it wouldn't populate into the grade book for some of you, so I apologize. So I'm going to turn the camera around. We'll start on the back row with the first group, and we'll see if this helps in terms of the noise or the volume on the recording. Who's the first group here? This guy up there. We'll start on the other side. Okay. So you kind of got to watch if you're right under a speaker. The feedback. Who's the first?
All right, we are stronger together. The nation that we selected was China. We chose it for several different reasons. The first is because they do not have sufficient environmental policy, which in turn reduces the cost of production. They devalue their currency, which makes it cheaper for them to export goods and more expensive for countries to import goods. Devaluing their currency is one of the reasons that we have a trade deficit of $365 billion with them. And they are also the top 5 richest companies in the world are actually Chinese banks.
Okay, very good. That's a good response. So you think that their banking gives them a competitive advantage. Mm-hmm. All right?
All right, who's next?
Who's next?
We are ATD, and we have China as well as the greatest economic advantage or challenge to the United States. And they have a higher population, more advanced technology, and the U.S. owes quite a bit of money to them. So we have the U.S. also outsources a lot of manufacturing to China, and China is the largest indicator for economic success worldwide.
Okay, that's a really good response. Yeah, I think that's, you're focusing on the U.S. debt and what we owe to them is an important factor in that consideration. Okay? All right.
Okay, we are Team Sunshade, and we said that, I think it said economic bloc as well as country and region, and we said that potentially ourselves, we can be our greatest hindrance, and specifically political gridlock. Like in 2010, there was a bill proposed to give China more influence in the IMF, and after 2 years, it was shot down. Then 2 years later in 2014, China went and developed the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank as a direct competitor to the IMF. So for reasons like that, and then China also wanting to devalue the dollar and have a different global currency. So for reasons like that, China and then ourselves would be the greatest threat.
Okay, good answer. I think that's a plangent recognition in terms of their importance and play in the IMF. I think that's a good observation there. All right.
We're global marketing. We said China as well, though for slightly different reasons. Mostly dealing with technology. Because as the world becomes flatter, we're going to. As the world becomes flatter, companies can market themselves to different countries. As the cost of importing goes down, we can start importing more and more and more, so we can actually export labor to different countries. Companies are going to shop around to different countries for cheaper labor costs, for better regulations, and we're going to start exporting more so that we can have cheaper goods and services here. So we gain some benefit, but we're giving up some dominance for it.
Okay, so one of the arguments that economists will make is that when you experience a structural transformation in an economy, that it obviously creates there's a period of chaos in that structural transformation. Just like when we went from being an agricultural society to a industry-based society and from a rural society to an urban, there was a structural transformation in that, and that plays a role. And so I think that your group focusing on this idea that there is this structural transformation, the real powerhouse in our economy is no longer necessarily manufacturing of tangible products. It's those intangibles. All right?
We are TO Technologies, and shocker, we set up to China. The Chinese yuan is definitely the United States' biggest rival globally. Developed countries continue to outsource jobs to China while we also maintain a trade deficit. Despite their recent economic downturn, the effect it's had globally is actually testament to just how powerful that economy has become.
So do you think we can regain the balance of trade at some point?
Well, actually, as their middle class develops, that's slowing down a little bit. So at some point, that's going to level off and find some equilibrium.
Okay, all right, good answer. Which group wants to go next? All the way over there? We'll see if we can avoid feedback. We'll try it. This may not be the most wonderful idea I've ever had, but since I couldn't hear half of what people were saying on the, did it stop working?
It's muted.
It's muted? Yeah, just mute it button on the bottom.
Hello. Okay. Well, Mr. Sanders, I'd like to know how you're going to pay for all the costs. Oh, wrong venue. Sorry about that. We're Business Architect Solutions. The United States is potentially its own greatest enemy in regards to economic dominance. Business ethics are a crucial component of the United States. The United States has operated under ethical and moral laws that other countries have not. Our labor laws, environmental restrictions, pollution limitations, bribery deterrent, and numerous other regulations serve as a possible barrier between economic dominance and weakness. Deontological ethics would say that the end result of the laws and regulations put the United States at an economic disadvantage. They are justified through better working conditions, quality of product, and reputation.
Okay, so before you sit down, yeah, a lot of people do argue this, that we have, because of things like the EPA and restrictions, and you're going to hear this in the presidential debate, and one of the things that I will talk about in terms of segmenting today is that with regard to environmental regulations, a lot of the Republicans are now saying, look, we're not the biggest polluter in the world anymore. We used to be. We used to be the biggest polluter and the biggest user of natural resources. Now, the most carbon polluting atmospheric particles are being put out by major manufacturers in China and also across the border in Mexico. And so they're going to argue that we're not economically competitive in that environment. What I would say is that I think we can think about clean technology and developing those and becoming having a really strong competitive advantage in terms of being able to export those kinds of things like the wind turbines that you see out in western Oklahoma that were actually developed largely at Sandia National Labs, where they also where they worked on the bomb. So I think that's one of the things that we could think about. All right, which group wants to go next? All right. Is it on?
Hello. All right, so we're non-Vias, and we believe that China presents the greatest economic challenge to the United States economy because of their annual growth rates. The current growth rate is at 10.4%, while the United States is at 2.7%. And due to the rapid growth increase, there are predictions that their gross domestic product will surpass the U.S. in 2017.
Okay, all right, so you also said China, and you figured on their growth. If it slows significantly, I mean, at one point in time, what we saw in the late 1980s and the early 1990s was that a lot of people suggested that perhaps Japan would become the economic engine that could supplant the United States, and then all of a sudden their economy just went stagnant. Could that happen with the Chinese?
Right.
Okay, all right, very good. Who's...
We are District 3. We believe that China is the biggest threat to the United States in economic growth. We know that we send more money than they send to us when it comes to purchasing products. China is maturing into a more developed market of raw materials. China is the world's second biggest economy, and its expansion is lifting other economies around the world. It poses a threat to the United States dominance because people would buy more products directly from China instead of through the United States. China has also more fiscal flexibility than many of the other countries. The United States has the biggest economy with 19 trillion in GDP, and second place is China with 12 trillion in GDP. According to the DailyAnnual.com, we owe the Chinese mainland nearly $1.2 trillion.
Okay, so you also focused on the debt and the size of the growth of their GDP. All right, I think that's interesting. One of the things, though, when we think about it in terms of those competitive advantages that Porter mentions in the diamond of competitive advantages for nations is the infrastructure. And do they have a problem maybe with their infrastructure? After you get outside of the major metropolitan areas, you run into a lot of issues with being able to move goods and services quickly around the country in some places. All right, which other groups?
Our group is Teamwear, and we said that the Middle East, especially Saudi Arabia, is becoming an economic bloc to the United States. They are becoming one of the major oil producers in the world and have forced the oil and gas industry in the United States to drop. This has caused many companies such as Devon and Chesapeake to start layoffs.
Okay, so oil and gas obviously are a big portion of our economy. It's interesting that until recently, the stock market really didn't trend along with oil and gas. And if you looked at historic patterns, a lot of times when oil and gas were up, the stock market did less well in the 1980s, for example, than it did when it collapsed because people were able to spend more money. But now, because the energy sector is such a dominant part of our economy in so many states like Texas, which is a big state, obviously, we have to think about those kinds of factors. And for the first time, we are seeing a trend between oil and gas prices and the stock market. Okay?
Hello, we're Diversified Inc., and we also came up with China and the Chinese yuan as our challenge to the United States. We said that specifically in late 2015, the IMF added China's yen to its basket of reserve currencies. According to Bloomberg.com, this is the first noted change in the special drawing rights basket composition since 1999, when the euro replaced the Dutch mark and French franc. The yuan's inclusion is now seen as a strong representation of the global economy, and supporting factors of favoring the yuan comes from the fact that the United States gets most of its production goods, electronics and otherwise, from the Chinese. China's dense population also weighed heavily in our support of the yen. Also, the Chinese have a strong economy, and there has been movements to displace the dollar to the yen in oil dealings. The ratio of Chinese industry trade has increased from 2% in 1991 to 22% today in Eastern Asian countries. In the end, our determination was that the yen's presence in the global economy may seek to have an even greater impact than the euro and other currencies and present the biggest challenge to the U.S. in years to come.
Okay, really good. I think that's a good argument. I also wonder if, us being the global currency is really all that important to us, or if we should worry about that as much as we worry about the growth potential if we switch to another foreign currency to be the world's reserve currency. All right?
Hello. It's going to blow over in a second. There are many factors contributing to the United States loosening grip on the global economy, the greatest threat being the rise of China. China's GDP is predicted to surpass the United States in 2017. Since the collapse of the Soviet Union, the United States has been considered the dominant economic power in the world. Trade barriers coming down, deregulation, privatization, and lower tariffs contributed to an expansion in global trade. China has taken full advantage of this growing market. Although China is able to mass produce goods and export more than they import, it has come at a cost, not only an environmental cost, but they have successfully created their own financial bubble. Even with the threat of that bubble popping, China has truly become too big to fail, with new banks looming on the horizon like the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank competing with the IMF. China is setting itself up to become a major economic world power. The United States, at its current state, is in no position to compete with its neighbors to the east.
Okay, so you focused on this idea that there is a bubble there, but you think that they're too big to fail. Can countries effectively go bankrupt?
Yes.
They can default on their loans. I mean, that was a serious threat with the Greek government in the past 2 or 3 years. So when we say too big to fail, I don't know that anybody's actually too big to fail. The government thinks that some of our banks were. I'm not sure that was necessarily the best solution was to bail out the banks. I think maybe a better solution would have been to bail out the homeowners. And that would have pumped more money into the economy. But that's not what the government chose to do. So I'm not sure, but you did focus on the bubble. And one of the things that has been argued is that these bubbles have gone throughout history, and you only have to look at history. And there's a book called Extraordinary Popular Delusions and the Madness of Crowds that details all of these sort of bubbles throughout history that started out at one point in time. For example, Dutch tulips were worth more than gold, and it was a speculative bubble that burst. Okay, good. Do we have any other? One more group? Is there another group after that? Okay.
Okay, so we're Linda Friend, and we're going to go ahead and go with, in terms of GDP growth, of course, we've seen a lot of growth with China, and they are set to surpass the U.S., but as structural transformation shows, just like it happened with us, it will probably eventually phase into a service economy, and most of their workers are trained for industrial type jobs. Once they get out of this industrial age, since they kind of got into it way later than most developed countries like the US and England, and they get into their service economy, their GDP growth will drop just like ours. So maybe in the short term, while they're still kind of in this industrial era, they might pose a threat, but over time, that GDP growth is going to decline as they move into a service sector economy. looking at currencies, we're gonna go and go with the European Union because the worth of the euro and the pound sterling are worth more than the US dollar right now. And it's I think it's one of the only currencies in the world that's worth more than the US dollar, is that the general area. So in terms of purchasing power, the European Union has a lot more purchasing power.
Okay, one of the things that I'm surprised more people didn't come up with the European Union, because one of the things, again, if you look at those areas of strategic competitive advantage, what does Europe have that China doesn't? They don't have as big a population, but they do have a highly educated population, which China has, an increasingly larger percentage of economically advantaged people, but the Europeans have more. They also have more technology infrastructure already built in that they can use to switch, and they're already basically dominated by a service sector economy. All right, anybody else? Is there any other group? Okay. So let's talk about, since we talked about this competitive advantage in different markets, it's a nice segue into talking about segmenting, targeting, and positioning. And I'm going to give you an example of how you can target and segment, and since we're in the political, I wonder what happened to the lights here. Did somebody hit the lights? It got dark. In the political realm, but I want to start with watching an advertisement.
On lazy days, when it's chilly, turning up the heat costs money, and wrestling with blankets is silly. This one's too big, that one's too small, and a blanket can't cover it all. If you want to stay warm, you need Forever Lazy. The one-piece, lie-around, lounge-around, full-body lazy wear that covers you from head to toe in soft, warm fleece. Just slip it in, zip it, and get lazy. Now you're toasty warm from head to toe, and your hands and feet stay free, so you can talk on the phone, enjoy a good book, do homework, or just do nothing at all. Forever Lazy is made of ultra-soft, breathable fleece, and it's oversized for that baggy, comfortable, lazy day, perfect pajama feeling you love. Party it up with friends, or enjoy some downtime with pets. And do it all while staying warm, comfortable, and lazy. Forever Lazy comes in 4 stylish colors and sizes that fit everyone in the family. So you can all watch the big game together while Dad does what he does best. Whether you're raiding the fridge during a commercial break or cramming for a college exam, Forever Lazy keeps you comfy cozy. With a draw screen hoodie to keep the chilly weather away, Forever Lazy is the best way to stay warm outdoors. It will be the top of your next tailgate, and you'll stay warm and comfortable through the entire day. Uh-oh, gotta go? No worries. Forever Lazy will fit your matches in front and back for great escapes when duty calls. Forever Lazy in any size is just $19.95. Duty calls now will also include the fleece hoodies to keep your toes toasty warm. The hoodies are a $10 value, but they're yours free. Order now and we'll send you the Forever Lazy inflatable neck pillow, great for home, travel, or just being lazy. It's a $10 value, but it's yours free. Just pay processing and handling. Get the Forever Lazy, the hoodies, and the neck pillow, all for just $19.95. Here's how to order.
All right, so the reason I show you this commercial is because how many of you liked your onesies when you were a little kid? How many of you had onesies when you were a little kid? Gene Simmons, rock god, loves onesies, apparently. So this is an example of production philosophy, right? I mean, the only thing that he wasn't good for was maybe the only thing that the Forever Lazy wasn't good for is maybe that formal event, that black tie affair that you have to go to. But there were all kinds of different demographics there. It's great for tailgating, it's great for laying around, studying for exams, right? I mean, it's a completely undifferentiated market. They didn't make any attempt. It's a broad appeal, And it's a very production-oriented philosophy. So if we go back again, and this is an example of how sometimes those old philosophies stick around. If we go back to that production era, what we assumed, for the most part during that time period, was that a population was rather or largely homogeneous. That, you know, the car was a better way of getting around than the horse, and so you'd accept it in black when the Model T came out because you didn't have a lot of options. It was the horse or the Model T, and wasn't that so much better? And so we figured that people were basically the same, and we could mass produce goods for this large population, and we didn't have to pay a whole lot of attention. Now, once you get into the sales era, you start to see some more differentiation, but you still see the production of goods faster and quicker for largely what was viewed as being a homogeneous group. When we get into the marketing era, we recognize that people are different, that there are lots of different needs. You all are vastly different. As I look across the auditorium here, we have differences in gender, we have differences in age, we have differences in ethnicity, differences in socioeconomic backgrounds and experiences. Some of you probably came from rural Oklahoma. How many of you came from a small town in Oklahoma like me? All right. How many of you were born and raised in a big city? Okay. There's more of you than there were from the rural population. So those kinds of differences start to matter. And once we move into the relationship era, we really focus on this idea that you have to break the market up. And in the global market, certainly, and one of the things that the critical thinking was designed to encourage was this idea that there are, and we're now in this global market, we're going to have to compete in this global market, and there's not just a one-size-fits-all solution to most things. So we have to divide the market up. This involves marketing research into segments. What are marketing segments? Segments are groups of units, groups of the population. And what is a population in statistics? What is how do you define a population? For those of you who've had your stats, how many of you have had stats, business statistics? Almost everyone should have, because it's one of the things that's a prerequisite of this class here, business major. What is a population? It's a what? Anyone contributing to the economy? A population is defined as a well-defined collection of units. So we can talk about a population of people, we can talk about a population of a nation, we can talk about the population of a state. And within that population, there are going to be subsets of the population that are more or less homogeneous, that function and will respond to marketing persuasive techniques similarly. What's the one thing, for example, that makes you somewhat homogeneous as a group? Even though we look out, what is one marketing need that you all would respond to and have a need for as a collective subset of the population, as being members of this class? Cheap food. You're all students, so you need cheap food because that's important when you're working your way through school. Okay? How many of you don't need cheap food? What's one thing that you all do have to have? A what? A textbook. Everyone in here should. Maybe, you don't have to buy the textbook. And it's amazing to me how often students will say, I just didn't do very well on the exam. And I'll say, well, did you buy the textbook? Well, no. Well, that's kind of important because 50% of the questions come from the textbook and about 50% come from my lecture. So that's one thing that makes you all a group that is homogeneous, that will respond to a similar marketing persuasive technique, which is I select the textbook, you selected the class, you opted into the class, and so you're going to have to, or at least you should, buy the textbook, right? So once we break down the segments in the market, we have to decide who it is that we're going to market to. That's called targeting. Selecting those segments that you want to reach your products, that you want to market your products to. And then finally, positioning. Positioning is, and we'll talk about this again when we talk about advertising, is the connection or the nexus that we make between the product and the need in the mind of the consumer. So since we're in an election year, I thought I'd give you an example of how you can do this segmenting, targeting, and then positioning with regard to the political marketplace, because it's one of the areas of my research and focus. And so what we're seeing right now, what happened yesterday in Oklahoma? Bernie was in Oklahoma. Bernie Sanders was in Oklahoma. And who else was in Oklahoma? I think one of the Republicans, was it Donald Trump that actually came to Oklahoma City yesterday as part of the Republican primary? So Republican Party and the Democrat Party basically function as umbrella groups for various segments in the political marketplace. So under the Democratic umbrella and under the Republican umbrella, we have various segments that they appeal to. Who do the Republicans appeal to historically? Since Lincoln, they've been the party of business. Who else? What? Who else do they appeal to? What other segment do you think Republicans appeal to? What? Guns, okay. That's another segment of the population, the NRA, that they appeal to. That's another segment of people that like guns. How many of you own guns? How many of you have a concealed carry permit? Okay, a few of you. How many of you think we should be able to conceal and carry on campus? All right. Does that make this segment different than what you would find in a college classroom in, say, New York? Probably. Makes you a little different. So the NRA is one group. So you've got business, big business. As George W. Bush once said in a speech, business, that's Oklahoman and Texan for business. It's B-I-D-D-N-E-S-S, business. The business of business is what he said. The business of business is business, and it's the business of the Texas legislature to take care of business. So business is under the Republican umbrella. Who else is under the Republican umbrella? What other groups?
Conservatives.
Religious groups, yeah, religious organizations. People that identify themselves as highly religious generally have tended in the last 20 to 30 years to support the Republican Party. That wasn't always the case. Who was the first evangelical Christian to win the White House and really sort of got the movement with the evangelicals going? Jimmy Carter. He was a Southern Baptist, and he was fairly devout and identified as that. But the Christian coalition has coalesced under the Republican Party since that time. Lots of charismatics. Who else has coalesced under the Republican Party? So we've got business, we've got the NRA, we've got religion. Small, okay, rural population. They've also, coalesced under, for some reason, under the Republican Party. You find more in the buckle of the Bible Belt in the rural areas, people that identify as Republicans, which is kind of interesting because historically, who has supported farm subsidies? The Democrats have historically been the ones that have supported farm subsidies. Under the Democrat umbrella, who do you have? You have groups that identify with the National Organization of Women, now. Historically, the NAACP since the 1960s. Ethnic minorities. The Hispanic Chamber of Commerce. Who else is under the Democrat umbrella? Higher education. Higher education, okay. Education groups in general, labor unions, and that would include teachers' unions. The Democrats were highly supportive of the movement to recall Governor Scott Walker in Wisconsin when he basically broke the back of the teachers' union by denying them the ability to really influence public policy and lobby on behalf of their members. So you have labor, ethnic minorities, the National Organization of Women, educators. Yes, sir?
Abortion right activists?
Yeah, the pro-choice. So over here you have the pro-life. And interestingly enough, historically the pro-life life movement has been heavily influenced by the religious conservatives. But among your age group and your demographic, it's not necessarily religion anymore that identifies people as being pro-life or pro-choice. It's largely among what we're seeing in the younger generation. It's not so much a religious issue as it is a belief in due process and liberty and respect for the individual. When we ask your age group, those that are pro-life have a tendency not to identify necessarily as deeply religious, or if they do, it's usually associated with one of the more New Age non-denominational churches, but they view pro-life as being a human rights issue rather than a moral issue for your demographic. But yes, the pro-choice people are generally into the Democrats. So those are the demographics, the segments of sort of the political market. Now, if we look at that these two groups are going, we've broken it out into all these different groups, and these two groups are going to appeal to those targets. Now, how do they do that? Well, if we look at the political spectrum, this is where positioning comes in, making that mind in the connection of the consumer in the political marketplace. On the extreme left end of the political spectrum, you have communism. We don't have a lot of communists in the world today, although, as a result of Bernie Sanders, what has become popular, particularly among, again, your demographic group. Who is Bernie appealing to? Socialism, yeah. Socialism is a lesser form of collectivism, and Bernie Sanders has identified himself as a what? Democratic socialist. That would have been, in the 1980s, a very bad word in most of the United States. But among your demographic, it's appealing to you. And you don't necessarily view communism or socialism with the same negative lens that people from my generation and before my generation did, because we survived and went through the Cold War era. You all don't remember that. And we actually thought that there was a nuclear threat from Russia and that we could be blown up. And there were targets all over the United States. A lot of people thought that Tinker Air Force Base, because of the AWACS, was one of the major targets. Los Alamos, New Mexico, where they invented the first bomb, was a huge primary target. Sandia National Labs in Albuquerque was a huge target. And so that really had a very negative connotation. On the other end of the extreme spectrum is fascism, which is corporatism with a burning ideology. We don't have very many of those. That's even less popular than maybe communism. What we fight about in the American political spectrum is right here in the middle. And we generally say this is liberal, and it sort of coincides or coalesces around the Democrat Party, and this is the Conservative Party, and it typically coalesces around the Republican Party. Now, most people in public opinion polls on their political ideology identify as what? Now, most people say they're moderates. They say, I will vote, because in states like Oklahoma, where we have closed primaries, now the interesting thing about New Hampshire, which was the second state to go and vote, is what? They had an open primary, and so you could go and show up and say, I want to vote in either one. And so you had people that actually switched. In Oklahoma, you can't do that. You have to go down to your election board. You have to do it so many days before the election in order to be registered to vote in the polls, because the polling books close. I think it's 30 days before an election is when the polling books close. And you have to select either what? Republican, Democrat, or Independent. And if you select Independent, what happens to you? You don't get to vote. You don't get to vote in the primary elections. You get to vote in the general elections, but not in the primary. So most people say that they're in the middle. They select one or the other, particularly in closed primary states, because they have to. They want to be able to vote in those primary elections and have a selection. A lot of people have said or suggested that in Oklahoma, we have more people actually registering now as Republicans that actually have Democratic views, because the real selection process at the state level in Oklahoma has become heavily balanced on the Republican side. And so in those secondary races in state and local elections, that's the real fight is in that primary. So most people say that they are somewhere in the middle. They coalesce around the middle. What does that mean? Well, historically what it means is that most people in the United States are slightly economically conservative. And why is that? Why are we slightly economically conservative? It's because as a nation we bought into far more than any other nation the idea of the free market, capitalism. And you all don't like your paychecks being taken by the government. How many of you get really upset when you get your pay advice? You probably don't. Does anybody get a live check anymore? Anybody in here get a live check from their employer? Why do you get a live check? Does your employer not offer direct deposit? They don't. Wow, that's unusual. So you actually get a live check. The rest of you will get what's called a pay advice from your employer, which basically has the breakdown of all of the things, the deductions that are taken out of your paycheck. And a big percentage of that is what? It's taxes. And how many of you hate watching that portion? Before you even, it hits your bank, it's taken out and sent to the federales and the state government. How many of you resent the hell out of that? Most Americans do. They don't like taxes. So most Americans tend to be slightly economically conservative because they don't like taxes. But on social issues, they tend to be slightly liberal. So they say that they're in the middle. Now, what you can do, and what Bill Clinton did in 1992 as a candidate, was George Herbert Walker Bush was over here somewhere as the Republican. He was really a fairly moderate Republican. He ran against Ronald Reagan in 1980 in the Republican primaries, and he was the pro-choice candidate of the Republican Party at that time. And when Ronald Reagan asked him to join his ticket, he switched to being an unenthusiastic supporter of the pro-life movement. And Barbara Bush has continued to say that she's pro-choice. So he was somewhere over here, and Bill Clinton said, I'm not an old-style Democrat. I'm not a 1960s or FDR-style Democrat, a tax and spend liberal. I'm a new Democrat. And he positioned himself right here. He snuggled up just as close. He said, we're going to do things like have welfare reform. And we're going to encourage and deregulate some things. And under Bill Clinton, what was one of the things that they deregulated that led to a huge financial collapse in the most recent financial panic in the United States? They deregulated the banks. There are two types of banks. There's investment banks and commercial banks. They deregulated, they took down the firewall between the banks, between the investment bankers and the commercial banks, and that's led to some of the problems that we've had in the home mortgage industry, for example. So he snuggled up. Now what happened was, basically as part of the market, he had all of this market share, right? And he won the election and beat George Herbert Walker Bush. What's wrong with this positioning strategy? What's wrong with this positioning strategy? And why won't it work today? You got Bernie, who's now saying, where's Bernie? He's camped himself out way over here. And what's he doing? He's mobilizing his base. He doesn't care. These people over here are never going to vote for him. But what he thinks is that he can get enough people out there to the polls to vote for him to change the political landscape. Where's Hillary Clinton positioned herself in terms of as in opposition to Donald Trump and Ted Cruz and stuff like that? You know, Trump is over here, Cruz is way over here, and Marco Rubio is somewhere in between, and Clinton's somewhere right here. The danger in her position is that Bernie's over here, and these people are never going to vote for Marco Rubio. These people from this point over are never going to vote for Marco Rubio, Donald Trump, or Ted Cruz. But what's the risk that they will do? Since she's snuggled up so close to the Republicans and her, I'm a progressive who wants to get things done, meaning I will compromise, what does she run the risk of doing? Those people just won't vote. They'll get turned off by the whole system and they'll just not go vote. Now, if we apply this analogy to sort of the business sector, let's think about watches. So there are three theories in political science that that we talk about. One's called elite theory, the other's called classical democratic theory, and there's a third theory called pluralism. Let's think about this in terms of watches. Does Rolex want to sell a watch to everybody? They're positioning themselves in the exclusive category, right? And what are they going to do? They're going to target selectively and motivate people who want the prestige of buying a Rolex. That's what George W. Bush did in the 2000 election. He said, I'm not going to move. I'm going to be conservative and I'm going to motivate my base. And he got it out to vote. Rolex does the same thing. You were going to say something?
You always see Rolex advertised in like tennis and golf tournaments.
Yes, right. They're not advertising at NASCAR.
Yeah.
Are they? Rolex doesn't advertise at NASCAR. They advertise at golf tournaments. They sponsor horse shows. They sponsor, events so they're targeting a very select, but what do they want? In terms of the luxury watch market, Rolex has a big market share of that luxury watch market because it's such a well-known name brand, right? What's the watch that's sort of the watch for everybody that's positioned itself sort of in the marketplace to be an everyday watch for every person? Swatch, Fossil, maybe Timex. Timex, it takes a licking, it keeps on ticking. Anybody can afford a Timex. So these decisions really affect and will really drive what the company does and how successful it becomes. So segmenting and then targeting, picking up those segments that you want to appeal to, and then making that connection in the mind of the consumer. Now when we get to advertising, one of the things that you have to think about is, are the connections that you're making, are what you're saying in this idea of positioning matching with what the image is in the mind of the consumer. If you want to come up and put your recording devices up here, you're welcome to do that. I will tell you what's on the second exam. I have taken the second exam this morning. Again, just like Fox News, it's fair and balanced, and I made 100. So you should be able to do the same. I'll give you about 3 minutes to come up and put your stuff up here if you don't want to have to watch the entire video. Devices up here, don't forget to pick them up. Last time, one person forgot to get their device. They came back luckily before I left, so don't walk out. The roll sheet should be going around. Be sure and sign that today. Where is the roll sheet? People bring their devices up here. You have it, the roll sheet. If you need to sign it, please do so. Okay, so you should know, we started out talking about rational actor theory, and you should know the definition that your textbook gives you with regard to that theory of consumer behavior. And what kinds of processes, there are 2 that go on in terms of consumer behavior that you should recognize in individuals' decisions to purchase certain things. There are about 4 questions that involve identifying substantively or asking you which stage of the purchase decision-making process something occurs in. So, for example, a number of the questions say the second stage or the first stage is, and then some of the questions give you substantive examples of which stage would this occur in. So you need to know those stages in terms of first, second, third, and then also substantively be able to identify what occurs in those various stages of the consumer-making process. Problem recognition, things like that, information search. You should also know the types of information that your textbook talks about that are available, sources of information. And and be able to identify those sources in a substantive manner. So for example, it may ask you about things like consumer reports and what type of information that is. What's a corporate-driven source of information? There are some examples in your textbook. We talked about, in terms of this model of decision-making in the rational actor theory, when this is more likely to occur, i.e. between high-risk decisions versus low-risk decisions, and what kinds of things you're going to do in the evaluative process of distinguishing between those kinds of routine decision-making processes versus those more mentally intensive decision-making processes. You should know and be able to identify public sources of information, governmental sources of information, what happens in yielding of brand names and what role that plays in the decision-making process and where it occurs. There are substantive questions that ask you about what occurs in terms of post-purchase behavior. And one of the things that I've talked about since the beginning, and when we started talking about the new era of marketing, which is called the relationship era, is this idea of customer lifetime value. And what kinds of things a company that focuses on customer lifetime value will engage in doing to ensure customer satisfaction. You need to be able to identify substantively influences, things like surroundings, temporal influences, the difference between organizational buying and consumer or end user buying. What types of organizational buyers substantively buy certain things? So for example, your text talks about those that will buy raw materials versus those that just resell or are intermediaries. Your text gives you some examples of things like wholesalers and retailers and what they do as opposed to other types of industrial or organizational buyers. What are the three types of organizational buyers? There's for-profit, non-for-profit, governmental. Understanding the differences between industrial markets there are ones that ask you specifically to identify what comprises an industrial market, a substantive example. Your text tells you which type of firms comprise the highest percentage of industrial markets in the United States. You should know that. The difference between a services market and a product market. In terms of globalization and global trade, the trends there, which are the largest exporting
countries, which are the largest importing countries. We talked about that today and the critical thinking in terms of the market dominance of the dollar versus other currencies. There are 5 questions. 4 questions, I guess. 4 questions that deal with the North American Industrial Classification System. Those ask specifically, you have to know which place and what the digits stand for in terms of whether it's the sector, industry, sub-industry, things like that. And then what the advantages and disadvantages of that system are. Your text lists a number of disadvantages and advantages that organizations can use that information to provide them with information in terms of the size of markets, but there is a disadvantage as well. What are the important factors in selling to business? And I talked about those in class, things like delivery time, technical specification becomes important, size of orders, different types of buying for organizations, from straight rebuy to generating RFPs, requests for proposals. Why global marketing is important. There's a question that asks you particularly about the case study, beginning of the chapter. The dynamics of world trade. What are some of the dynamics of world trade, globalization? The impact of things like the World Bank, the IMF. Types of global trade that you can engage in, from simply exporting, licensing, joint ventures, and then there are some substantive questions that deal with examples of that. So specific brand names are mentioned. You should be able to identify what kind of thing they're doing in terms of, is it an export or a licensing agreement, or is it contracting for production? What does Apple actually make their own products, for example? Do they make the iPhone? No. They do what? Foxconn is a company, a corporation in China that manufactures the iPhone for Apple. What is it when you engage in direct investments? What is it when you sell virtually the same product in another country? The differences between product extension and adaptation. Product customization. Your text talks about dumping. You need to know what that is. You need to know the definitions of market segmentation. Be able to identify an example substantively of market segmentation, targeting, and positioning. The definition of product differentiation. Do you all have any questions? Yes, sir.
Do you know about options on reverse auctions?
I don't have a question on reverse auctions. That's a good question. No, I don't have a reverse auction question on this example. Other questions? All right, be sure to put a device up here with it.